This story is a heavy weight I've carried for 3 years, a true account of a life dismantled and rebuilt from the ashes of a lie. I found the silver Tiffany bracelet I'd given Alina for our 10th anniversary dangling from the gearshift of a black Audi RS7 that was on mine. Parked in the shadows of the lower level of Wacker Drive while my wife's head was buried in another man's lap in the back seat. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The Chicago winter has a way of cutting through you, but that night the wind off Lake Michigan felt warm compared to the ice forming in my veins. I stood in the dark, my breath hitching in the frozen air, watching the rhythmic movement of the car's suspension. I had followed her because the late-night strategy sessions at her PR firm had started to smell less like coffee and more like expensive bourbon and Chanel No. 5. Alina was a high-powered executive on the Magnificent Mile, a woman who commanded rooms and dictated narratives. I was the architect who designed the rooms she stood in, solid, dependable, and apparently completely invisible. I didn't knock on the window, I didn't scream. I stood there like a ghost, paralyzed by the sight of her wedding ring, catching the dim yellow light of the parking garage as she ran her hand through another man's hair. That man was Julian Vance. I knew him. He was a tech disruptor, a 30-year-old trust fund kid with a jawline carved by surgeons and an ego that required its own zip code. He was also her biggest client. I walked back to my own car, my boots crunching on the salt-stained concrete. I sat in my Ford, the engine cold, and stared at the steering wheel until my vision blurred. 12 years, and we had built a life in a brownstone in Lincoln Park. We had discussed names for children we hadn't had yet. We had survived my father's cancer and her mother's bankruptcy. Or so I thought. In reality, I had been building a cathedral for a woman who preferred living in a gutter. Next morning, the gaslighting began with surgical precision. Alina walked into the kitchen wrapped in a silk robe, smelling of hotel soap and betrayal. She kissed my cheek dry, rehearsed movement hand, complained about how exhausting the merger negotiations were. "You're home late again," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was a percussion of rage. She sighed, a sound of practiced martyrdom. "Mark, don't start. I'm bringing in 7 figures this year. If I'm not there to hold Julian's hand through these press releases, the whole deal falls apart. You want the house? You want the vacations in Cabo? This is the price. I just want my wife," I said. She rolled her eyes, pouring herself an espresso. "You're being needy. It's unattractive. Maybe if you focused more on your own firm's billable hours and less on my schedule, we'd both be happier." She looked at me with a flick of disgust, as if I were a stain on the marble countertop she'd insisted we import from Italy. That was the moment the loyal, broken husband died and the architect took over. An architect understands that before you can rebuild, you have to perform a controlled demolition. You have to find the load-bearing walls and pull them down. Over the next month, I became a ghost in my own home. I played the role of the doting, slightly oblivious husband. I bought her flowers, apologized for being insecure, and all the while, I was documenting every breath she took. I hired a private investigator named Miller, a retired CPD detective who lived on cigarettes and spite. "She's not even being careful, kid," Miller told me 3 days later, sliding a manila envelope across a greasy table at a diner on Western Avenue. "They're using his penthouse at the Waldorf Astoria. They're dining at Alinea on his corporate card. They think you're a doormat." The photos were high-resolution daggers. Lena laughing at a joke Julian made, her hand on his chest. Lena entering the hotel at 11 p.m. and leaving at 4 a.m. But it wasn't just the sex. Miller had found something much more lucrative, the paper trail. Alina wasn't just sleeping with Julian. She was helping him embezzle funds from his own company to offshore accounts. Skimming off the top of the PR budget to fund a lifestyle she planned to enjoy once she finally dumped the deadweight me. I found the burner phone hidden in a hollowed-out copy of Architectural Digest in her home office. The messages were a masterclass in cruelty. "Julian, does the boar know yet? Lena, Mark, please. He's busy drawing lines on paper. He thinks I'm a saint. I can wait to see his face when I serve him the papers and walk away with the house and the Lake Geneva property. He's so weak he'll probably apologize for failing me. Julian, I love how bad you are. Meet me at the garage in 20. Reading those words felt like being flayed alive. She didn't just want to leave. She wanted to ruin me. She had been slowly moving our joint assets into an investment vehicle she controlled. Thinking I was too distracted by my blueprints to notice the foundation of my own life was being eroded. I didn't confront her. I didn't cry. I went to a lawyera woman named Sarah, who specialized in high-conflict divorces and had a reputation for leaving her opponents in tatters. "I don't just want a divorce, Sarah," I said, sitting in her glass-walled office overlooking the loop. "I want her to feel the weight of every lie she's told. I want Julian Vance to realize that disruption works both ways." Sarah looked at the evidence Miller had gathered: the embezzlement, the texts, the photos. She smiled, and it was the coldest thing I'd ever seen. "An architect, huh? Well, let's get to work on the blueprints for their funeral." The plan took months. It had to be perfect. I continued to eat dinner with her, listening to her talk about her stressful days. I even went to a couples therapy session. She suggested a tactical move on her part to establish a record of my instability for the eventual custody and asset battle. I sat on that beige couch and listened to her tell the therapist that I was emotionally distant and lacking ambition. I cried on cue. I looked pathetic. In the background, I was working with Julian's board of directors anonymously. Julian was the face of the company, but he was a liability, using the data Miller had scraped from Elena's laptop during one of her all-nighters. I fed the board's internal auditors tips about the PR anomalies. I wasn't just the husband anymore. I was a shadow in their ledgers. The climax was set for the night of the Innovators Gala at the Art Institute of Chicago. It was the social event of the year. Elena was the lead organizer. Julian was the guest of honor, set to receive an award for ethical leadership in tech. The irony was delicious. I dressed in my best tuxedo. Lena looked stunning in a floor-length emerald gown, her arrogance radiating off her like heat. She barely looked at me as we entered the grand ballroom, the ceiling soaring above the elite of Chicago. "Try not to talk too much, Mark," she whispered, adjusting my tie with a patronizing pat. "These people are movers and shakers. Just stand there and look like you belong." "I'll do my best, Elena," I said. "Tonight is going to be unforgettable." Julian was at the head table, smug and untouchable. He gave Elena a wink that I wasn't supposed to see. The evening proceeded with the usual fluff: expensive champagne, hollow speeches, the clinking of silver against china. Then, it was time for the keynote presentation, a video montage of Julian's achievements produced by Elena's firm. The lights dimmed. The massive screen at the front of the room flickered to life. The video started with the expected shots of Julian at ribbon cuttings, and after 10 seconds, the audio cut out. A new image appeared. It was a screenshot of a text message, blown up to be 20 feet tall. "Elena, I can wait to see his face when I serve him the papers and walk away with the house. He's so weak." A gasp rippled through the room. Lena froze, her glass of moat halfway to her lips. I sat perfectly still, watching the color drain from her face until she looked like a marble statue. The screen changed. It wasn't a video anymore. It was a slideshow of bank statements, offshore transfers from Julian's company to an account held in Elena's name. The word embezzlement appeared in bold red letters across the screen, followed by the specific dates and amounts. Then came the finale. The grainy, high-definition photos from the parking garage on Wacker Drive, the silver Tiffany bracelet hanging from the gear shift, the unmistakable image of Elena and Julian in the back seat of the Audi. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a vacuum of shock. Then the murmurs began, a low, rising tide of scandal. Julian stood up, his face turning a mottled purple. "Turn it off! Who the hell is doing this?" I stood up slowly. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I walked to the podium, the spotlight catching the calm resolve on my face. The technician, whom I had paid a year's salary to accidentally load the wrong file, disappeared into the wings. "I think the presentation speaks for itself," I said into the microphone, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Lena, you always said I didn't have enough ambition. I hope this meets your standards." I looked directly at Julian. "The board of directors is waiting in the West Gallery, Julian. They have the full forensic audit, and the Chicago Police Department is waiting in the lobby. It turns out, when you steal from shareholders to buy your mistress a condo in Gold Coast, people tend to notice." Elena was shaking, her hands clawing at the tablecloth. "Mark, you can't. This isn't real. It's the only real thing in our marriage, Elena," I said. I walked out of the ballroom. I didn't look back at the chaos. the shouting, or the flashes of phone cameras, as the movers and shakers documented the downfall of their golden couple. I walked out into the crisp Chicago night, the air feeling cleaner than it had in years. The aftermath was a massacre. Julian Vance was indicted within 48 hours. His tech empire collapsed as investors fled, and he ended up taking a plea deal that involved 3 years in federal prison and total restitution. He was a coward at the end, crying in his mugshot, blaming Elena for everything. Elena's ruin was more intimate. Her firm fired her for cause within the hour, citing the morality clause and the blatant conflict of interest. Because I had documented her intent to defraud me and her use of marital assets to facilitate Julian's embezzlement, Sarah, my lawyer, tore through her like a hurricane. She didn't get the house. She didn't get the Lake Geneva property. Because of the wasteful dissipation of marital assets through her gifts to Julian and her offshore accounts, the judge awarded me nearly everything. She ended up in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood she used to mock, working a low-level entry job for a boutique firm that didn't know her history. Her social circle, built on the shallow foundation of status, evaporated instantly. In Chicago, scandal is a scent that never quite washes off. A few months later, I was sitting in a small, quiet diner in River North. The door opened, and Elena walked in. She looked older. The emerald gown was replaced by a cheap wool coat. Her hair, once perfectly styled, was pulled back in a fraying ponytail. She saw me and hesitated, then walked over. "You destroyed me, Mark," she said, her voice trembling. "Was it worth it? 12 years of marriage and you threw it all away for a stunt?" I looked at her, and for the first time I felt nothing. No anger, no love, no regret. Just the cold clarity of a completed project. "I didn't destroy anything, Elena," I said quietly. "I just stopped holding up the walls you were already tearing down. You threw away 12 years the moment you thought my loyalty was a weakness to be exploited." She tried to say something. A final manipulation, a plea for sympathy, but the words died in her throat. She realized there was no one left to perform for. I paid my bill and walked to my car. I drove down Lakeshore Drive, the skyline of Chicago sparkling like diamonds against the dark water. I was an architect. I knew how to build things that lasted. And I knew that sometimes the most beautiful thing you can design is the exit. I still have the silver Tiffany bracelet. I keep it in my desk drawer as a reminder that even the most expensive things can be worthless if they re-held by the wrong hands. The end.